We made it happen. What? Like what? Thomas, we made this happen, dude.
It's been like a year and a half or something of trying to make it work.
I know it's been a minute, man. I got to tell you, I know we were jamming a few minutes before we got started today. Genuinely, from the bottom of my heart, I just want to tell you thank you for what you do. Thank you for being so informative. And here, I always talk about on the podcast, like I'm one of those guys. Like I got my degree in exercise science with minor nutrition, so like I'm a data geek. Like show me the studies, and I love the fact, man, that you cite actual clinical data. It's awesome.
Thanks, man. I mean, at the end of the day,
Yeah.
I try to, I always say follow the science, don't just follow the evidence, right? Because it's like there's a difference between the science and the evidence, and sometimes the evidence is 10 years old and we need to acknowledge the evidence, but we also need to look at what's coming out in the way of science. And the only way that you can actually do that is, we kind of have a joke. It's but in God we trust, for everything else, give me data.
That is so true, man. So, father of two, I would love to know, like, let's go back to little Thomas. I'd love to know just how you grew up, like your family dynamics growing up, your own parents, siblings, even sports you played. What was growing up like for you?
Childhood was interesting for sure. I think everyone has a little bit of a dysfunctional childhood, so I wouldn't say I'm unique when mine was like quote unquote dysfunctional, because it wasn't dysfunctional. Like I had good parents, but when I was 13, some stuff happened to my mom, and making a long story short, I was kind of on my own from the time I was about 13 on. So it was it was a rocky teenage bout for sure, but made it happen. Ended up independent studying, kind of homeschooling through high school because I was working full time to help support my mom and cover some medical bills and things like that. So I was kind of forced to grow up really quick, but I always found my sanity in running. So as a little kid, from the time I was 6 years old, I think I was like six when I ran my first 10K, and 11 years old when I ran my first marathon. And running as a kid was my coping mechanism for a pretty difficult childhood and a lot of stresses. So I quickly fell in love with something that I could control. It was one of those things where running was just, my fitness was something that, it was one element of my life that I felt like I was in complete control of in a pretty chaotic childhood and whatnot. So I did, because of the way that I was doing technically independent study and not technically homeschool, I was still affiliated with the school, with the high school. So I ended up running cross country, played rugby and track, really fell in love with rugby. To this day, I still like to play sevens when I can. Rugby is just a fun sport. That was the teenage years for me. I met my wife when I was in high school. So I was 16, she was 14. We both kind of came from broken families in a way. So we really got glued to each other at a young age. Like we really
Mm.
leaned on each other. I don't want to say we became dependent on each other, but we really did lean on each other. She had her own family struggles with her mom and dad and hairy divorce, and my family was broken. So it was like we almost had a little bit of a trauma bond in a way without knowing it. Uh, so I mean, she and I really spent a lot of our teenage years together. So there's a lot to unpack, but at the end of the
Mhm.
day, I think early on I learned the value of work ethic. I learned the value of a dollar. I learned the value of exercise.
That is unreal, man. What about your dad?
My dad was a great dad. It was just an interesting situation, and I think a lot of kids and a lot of adults looking back at their childhood can appreciate this. My mom was struggling with some mental illness, so I don't want to throw her under the bus. I'm very careful with that because my mom was a great mom, but she was struggling in her reality. There was a lot of things that were, as kids, kind of put on us. Like my dad was a really bad guy, this and that. As I got older and into my later teenage years, and I was able to develop my own relationship with my dad, I realized that my dad was actually a great guy, and there was just a lot of sort of things that were put on us as kids about my dad that weren't exactly true, because my parents divorced when we were pretty young. And so my dad was around, and in retrospect was really a good father with what he was given and the access that he had to us. And so then I developed a relationship with him later in my teenage years, got really close to him. And then unfortunately he died of cancer shortly thereafter. So I didn't get a lot of a relationship with my dad until it was kind of too late, which I'm saddened by, but the years that I did have with my dad were really awesome when I did, when I was an adult.
You seem like just one of those guys that fatherhood family is so important to you. And it's interesting about your dad and not meeting him until later in life. I actually didn't meet my biological father until I was 30, and it was by accident. I was in a coffee shop, and so was he. And I had a brief relationship with him when I was 12, and then we drifted apart again. But I see how you operate, and it seems like family is so important to you. And I'm curious, growing up the way you did and a brief relationship you had with your dad, you probably felt what it feels like to not have a father figure around, that you might have wanted your whole life. Is that one of the reasons that you're so on point with being a parent now?
I think subconsciously, yes. I feel like I was I was sort of robbed of a good relationship with my dad, and I know what that feels like as an adult. When you're a kid, that's just reality. That's just life. Like, you don't think you're not sitting there going, "Oh, I'm longing for this relationship with my dad." It's not really happening. But then when you're an adult, you can reverse engineer some of the decisions you make, and you're like, wow, if I had a solid father figure in my life, maybe I wouldn't have made that decision. There's decisions that I made as a teenager in my late teens that I'm not proud of, that I'm not happy about, some drugs and things like that. And I'm like, wow, I didn't have a dad in my life. I didn't and it's not because he didn't want to be there, so I see the value in a father figure, and that looks all kinds of different ways, right? Like, there's no model father. Like, it's just how you show up is how you show up. But there's nothing more that I want out of my life than to be a dad. Like, that's just, do remember my dad saying, pretty much on his deathbed, he was just about to go into hospice. And I remember my sister asking him, Dad, you've got to have goals. Like, what are your goals, Dad? Like, because he was a professional race car driver. He was a pretty badass dude. And because she was trying to kind of inspire him to like get this life back. Like, he was dying of cancer, but she didn't want him to just wallow in self-pity, and she wanted him to like set goals. And he's like, well, my kids are my goals. And I remember my sister giving him some crap on that. No, you got to have like real goals, Dad. Like, what is your goal? Do you want to get back on the racetrack? And he said, no, my goal is you kids. And I remember, as a guy, I wasn't even a dad yet, obviously, understanding what he was saying. I remember kind of my sister being like, that's not a real goal. And me kind of stopping my sister and be like, actually, no, that's a very viable goal. Like, before I was even a dad, I knew that like our biological purpose, like, once we have kids, it's not about us anymore. Like, it's about how we frame the world for our kids to take over for us, right? So like, in an essence, it's a more powerful position to be in. You may not be pulling the levers as much yourself, or maybe you are, because maybe the drive of being a father helps you pull those levers harder. But for me, I was able to see at that point in time, like, no, I know my dad's a good dad, because like, this is his purpose in life is to carry on not just a legacy, but the drive to truly change the world. And then when I did become a dad, it all clicked. It was like everything changed. My fears went away. This sounds crazy to say. This is going to sound totally nuts, but my fear of dying actually went away after I had kids. And I say that because I now realize that like my biological purpose, I've brought life into this world. I know that like I've done the job that I need to do, and I can put my best foot forward and push it all the way, knowing that I'm setting the right example for my kids. I'm not going to put myself in harm's way and do something crazy. But it's interesting because it's the opposite of what people might think. Like, you might think, okay, you become a dad, and suddenly you're like, well, I want to make sure that I'm around for my kids. And I do. Like, I don't want to make stupid decisions, but I'm like, I've made it. This is the pinnacle. And some people don't like that logic, but to me, it makes a lot of sense. Like, I have reached the pinnacle of what I need to do in my life. Now it's about making sure that I'm setting the example for my kids.
Mm. I love that outlook. I got to tell you, man, in all my interviews that I've done, I have not heard that, but I welcome that. That's incredibly enlightening. And it's a different vantage point than I've heard from other people. I love that. I want to go back to your childhood with one more question, because I think it's appropriate and I think it's important. You did mention that you got into a few bad things here and there, but it sounds like for you, like a foundational control piece that you had in your life was running, right? And I think any teenager that's faced with some of the challenges that you were faced with could have easily gotten more down the road with really, really bad things. Instead, you made this pretty conscious effort to exercise as a kid, which most kids steer clear of. So what was it in you that I guess gave you peace or gave you even motivation to do that stuff?
Yeah, I mean, there's a motivational aspect, and then there's a validation aspect too, because my mom was a runner, and from an early age, my mom kind of made it clear that if we weren't running, then we weren't really going to be hanging around her because that's what she liked to do. So there was an element of it that was a little bit fear-based, but I didn't feel that way as a kid. Like I thoroughly enjoyed running. She was never, making me run. It wasn't like that. It was just like simple matter of fact. All right, I'm going to go run this half marathon. So like dad's not around. So like I'm going to train for it. I can't leave you at home alone. So you're training with me. So in a little bit of a way, it was a selfish move on my mom's part, but I'm so, so, so glad she did it. Like, because even though some would say, oh, that's wildly unhealthy for you to be running at that age. No, she was never forcing us to. My sister and I both. My sister ended up becoming a, elite level professional triathlete. I went the direction that I went, but there was definitely an element of coping that came with running. I was ADHD most of my life anyway. So running was, and people, it shows in my videos. People can just see like how obsessed I really truly get about this stuff. I've just learned how to harness it. But running was a way for me to sort of calm my brain. And when life got crazy, when life got stressful, I knew I could always turn to running. And there were similar tendencies that I could see happening in not so healthy ways that I caught at a young age. Smoked a lot of pot as a kid, and I could see myself going that route too, right? Like, but instead running sort of course corrected me. It was like, okay, I know I can make a healthy decision because I'm an all or nothing person. And the same reason I ended up kind of struggling with my health later on as I got into the business world, and I put all or nothing into that, and let my health go for a while. So, but now with the years and the maturity under my belt, I know my personality. I'm not going to try to change my personality. I know that I'm going to get hyper focused on things. I just need to make sure that they're the right things.
I love that, man. And let's go to that point in your life where you were unhealthy. So you and I were talking before we hit record today. I started following you about a year and a half ago, and just aesthetically, I'm like, man, like this guy like has probably been in shape his whole life. Like he's known what to do his whole life. And then I bought your book and I heard your story and I'm like, no way. Like there's no, and then not too terribly long ago, it was probably like a few weeks ago, I saw your video about the stretch marks thing and how you embrace the stretch marks. And I'm like, I got to tell you, man, big fan of yours, but I'm like, I love this dude even more. Like all these imperfections, he embraces the imperfections, but yeah, tell me about that point in your life where you were the heaviest and you had to make a change.
Yeah. I mean, part of it started from injuries from running, like where I was starting to bang up my knees from running and rugby. I was getting beat up. So I had some injuries that helped me stay away from running for a while. And that was where it all kind of started, was like once running was out of the equation, candidly, I was still eating like I was running. I was, I was running a lot. So, I mean, if I had to guess, I'd probably say I was pushing like 6,000 calories a day on some of my longer run days, right? It was like, wow. I mean, you're training marathon prep. You can eat that, and it's, so first of all, it's ingrained in my mind that that's normal eating, right? So and I know this happens to a lot of like ball players and stuff like that. Like you see them, they play ball in college and then all of a sudden they're like, I don't know what's going on. Well, yeah, because you're not in training camp anymore. You're not, it's as simple as that. But the long and the short of it is, I got into the healthcare world. I was at that time, doing some recruitment and stuff like that's kind of the realm that I was in. And I mean, truthfully, I started making some money, started focusing on business. And, next thing you know, I'm like sitting at a desk 12 hours a day, not really running anymore. I had done some lifting because when I was playing rugby, I knew that I needed to put some size on. So I'd gotten up to like, 170 pounds or something playing rugby as a winger. So I wasn't like a stranger to the gym. So it wasn't like I'm making it really clear. I wasn't just like an obese sloppy person. I wasn't like just sitting there, I was built, but it just happened kind of slowly. It was like working out 3 times a week, then down to 2 times a week, then once per week. And then, focusing on business, work is more important. Okay, I'm making good money. This is my priority. So it's like in the back of my mind, I knew what was happening. I'd always been a pretty fit kid, and I knew I was letting myself go, but I convinced myself that it was okay because I could, A, I'll get it back. B, like I gotta, grab this coin while I can. All the wrong decisions. I mean, I ended up putting on over 100 pounds in a couple of years, less than a couple of years, literally made myself type 2 diabetic. Like I literally clinically ended up being type 2 diabetic, but based on where my glucose was at and my HbA1c. And this is crazy. I mean, that's how unhealthy I was. Like multiple monsters or rock stars per day, fully leaded sugar ones. Just, it was bad, man. And I was, working like 12 to 16 hour days, just hammering, sitting at a desk. And that's it, man. And then, one day it kind of clicked. Probably heard the story. I've talked about it a million times, but I was, at a Jack in the Box. I'd gone through the Jack in the Box drive-through, and I'm sitting in the parking lot eating my Jack in the Box tacos. And this dude that I knew fairly well, but not super well, drove by, waved at me. And it was like, at that moment when he waved at me, it was like this feeling of shame that I got caught. And I'm like, this is how people see me. I'm like, I was always the fit guy. I was always the skinny kind of runner guy. So I just imagined that people would still continue to see me as that, and that it would be a complete shock if I was like in the parking lot gorging myself with tacos. And then when this guy just waved at me like it was nothing, and I'm just like, wait a minute, no, wait, this wasn't a surprise to him. He didn't like crash his car, because, oh my gosh, Thomas is eating tacos. No, it was like, no, that's what I would expect Thomas to do. For some reason, it was like an element of shame. It's kind of funny, but it just like, no, wait, this has got to change. Like people can't see me like this. This is not me. And that's what it was. It was just a serious internal call to action of this is not me. And there's a lot of people that are overweight that do feel that way. It's like they're a shell of a human, and they're carrying around this weird shell, and they're like, this isn't me inside. And they're telling themselves every day, this isn't me inside. So it's like being overweight for some people is like a true identity crisis. They're living with this weird identity crisis where their body is occupied by someone else, And it took that call to action for me to just like almost go into the third person for a minute and be like, what the hell's going on? Like, this needs to change. So like that day, that was it. Actually, I joke, I did go back to Jack in the Box like one more time after that, but then it was done.
So I'm actually picturing like this part in Dodgeball where Dwight at the very end, played by Ben Stiller, he's eating his chicken wings. He's like Chuck Norris, and he's gained like all that weight. But yeah, man, I totally get that. Like I said, like I'm right there with you in lockstep because I used to be overweight myself. I know exactly what that feels like. Let me ask you this. There are several different things that you do. And like, so for instance, I love your videos of like, here are the 12 things that I have in my refrigerator at all times. And by the way, your lemonade is disgusting, but I drink it every day. Like, because of the benefits of that apple cider vinegar with the lemon and all that, the turmeric. And, but I do feel better with it, but I would love to know, a lot of dads out there, this is dad focused show. It's time. It's even guilt. Like I can't take time away from my family to go train. I can't take time or energy to meal prep. I can't take time or energy to eat right. I'm on the go so much. My kids need this or that. I don't and never have subscribed to that. And because I think my view is probably the same as yours, which is it's actually more important for me to be the healthiest possible human being that I can be, because I have 4 other small human beings that my wife and I are in charge of. And for you, I would just love for you to share perhaps a day in the life or a week in the life of Thomas DeLauer, why you eat the things you do from a scientific reasoning standpoint, even intermittent fasting, why you do that, Um, and most importantly, why this is so important to you.
Almost every day starts the same. And this is something
Okay.
that a lot of present dads are going to feel. Because every day starts the same with me getting out of bed early and being overwhelmed with the guilt of, do I go to the gym right now and miss my kids getting up and miss this morning with like when they first wake up? Do I put the onus on mom for them waking up? Or do I stay and wake up with them for a little bit and then go to the gym and have a late start to my day? And this is like a reality for me every single morning. I wake up early and I wrestle with, well, if I go to the gym now, I'm missing out on this morning with them. And I'll come back, before they go to school or we homeschool our kids, but we still like go to a pod, right? So like before my son goes to homeschool pod. And I'd say I make a conscious decision half the time, maybe 3/4 of the time, to go to the gym and miss right when they wake up. And that is a struggle every single day. And I want to make sure that like people know that guilt is real, and that guilt means you're a good dad. If you didn't have that guilt at all, then you need to look at yourself, because that guilt it's not guilt. I don't see it as guilt. I see it as, this is a fork in the road, but it's not just two directions that you can go. It's not like, if I go to the gym, I'm a bad dad. If I stay home, I'm a good dad. No, because there are certain days where it makes more sense for me to go to the gym a little later and prioritize. And most of the time, I don't care if my kids see that, well, oh, dad's not here. Yeah, he went to the gym already. He's working hard. And you know what? Then I come home and I still get to spend quality time with them in the morning. So the point is I wrestle with that, and that's a really real thing. But usually, as far as like tactically what I do, I get up, I do have apple cider vinegar, lemon, water, sometimes just ACV. Sometimes I skip it. I don't do it every single day. It depends on, how fast I'm getting out the door. People are going to laugh, but, I get a large green tea, usually from Starbucks, with no water or anything in it. Or no sweetener or anything in it, just straight venti green tea. That's always been my like pre-workout or intra-workout. Go to the gym, almost invariably train fasted. My training's all over the place with the kind of training that I do, which is the way that I like it. Like I'm such a nutrition oriented guy. When people watch my content, they're like, I wonder what he does for workouts. And the thing is a lot of times I don't even know what I'm doing that day. But I found that that's what actually works really well for me, is I do it all. One day I'll do CrossFit. One day I'll do running prep. One day I'll power lift. One day, and I found that having organized chaos with that has been hugely beneficial for me, because it's allowed me to just be decently good at everything. I don't have any desire to be like a specialist in one thing, because, I'm going to be 40 in a couple of years. I don't care about trying to be specialized in one thing. I want to be good at all of it. Then come home. A lot of times, I'd say 2 or 3 days a week, I'm fasting, doing some form of a fast, whether it's 16 hours or 20 hours. It all kind of depends on if I'm filming that day. Like if I'm filming, I usually like to be fasted because my brain works a little bit better. So if I'm filming that day, it might be a 20-hour fast. But generally, if I am eating and I'm going to kind of eat breakfast after my workout, it's usually something that's pretty large, contrary to what a lot of people think. Just because I intermittent fast and skip breakfast a lot, the days that I'm not fasting, I actually eat a large breakfast, because I prefer having a larger breakfast and then eating a little bit less as the day goes on. It's worked tremendously well for my sleep, and the data also supports it really strongly. So that breakfast can vary. It depends on the kind of workout that I was doing, but it's usually a ton of eggs. It's usually anywhere from 4 to 7 eggs or something like that, just depending on kind of where I'm at. A little bit of berries, maybe some ground beef mixed in with the eggs, usually like some kimchi or some sauerkraut with it, that kind of thing. So I'm still, I'm getting close to 1,000 calories with my breakfast a lot of times. Usually not heavy on the carbs first thing in the morning. And then as the day goes on, it's really a mixed bag. But one of the things that I will give as a helpful tip to dads is that the old thing there, you have to consistently be eating, or you have to, eat even a breakfast, a lunch, and a dinner, like just to absorb your nutrients and your protein. Like that's all done. That's water under the bridge now. Like the literature out there now shows that you could sit down and have 100 grams of protein in one sitting, and you're going to absorb that over the following hours. Like you don't have to have these organized meals where you're getting adequate protein at each meal. Like you could front load your day. And as a dad that is busy, that is running a business, I'm a present dad. We homeschool our kids, so I'm busy. My wife's busy, and there's a lot of days where I only eat 2 meals a day or 1 meal a day, and it's not because it's this organized OMAD type fasting. It's really not. I also call it accidental OMAD, but I know when it's going to happen because I know the way my day looks. So like I'll come into a day and I'll be like, shoot, today is going to be a long day. I don't know. I don't have enough food prep because I didn't have time yesterday to prep anything. It's real life. And this is stuff that your listeners are probably really dealing with. So you know what I'll do? I'll cook up a pound of ground beef because I have 15 minutes now. I'll cook up a pound of ground beef and I'll wolf that son of a gun down and, get as many calories as I can in, and then commit to just not eating the rest of the day, or not eating at least until dinner. Because where you get in trouble is with the little minutia and the snacks and the little things, because you're like, oh, I didn't eat that much, but I need to grab a snack. So what do? You grab a few ounces of almonds or something, and then you're at like 1,000 calories in almonds. And you're like, but it was light, it was small. I'm like, no, now you're getting yourself in trouble because you think you didn't eat much, but you actually did. So you're better off to just commit and say, I'm going to have this large breakfast, or I'm going to skip breakfast and eat a large lunch. And it has given me so much liberty and so much grace just with my, how I look at food, because I'm like, I can just sit down and have this big meal now, and then I don't have to worry about it. So unless you are literally working like a 24-hour straight shift away from food, like there's no reason you can't do that. There's no reason you can't sit down and have like 100, 120 grams of protein, have a big meal, and then just fast the rest of the day. And I feel like developing the time restriction principles, like that is probably the best gift that I have to give to dads. Like being able to teach that, it's so helpful, because then I can be present. I'm not thinking about food. I'm thinking about the time with my kids. I'm not just like, whereas humans, we're distracted by food constantly, especially when it's there. Like biologically, if food is around, we're going to be distracted by it because it's in our DNA to like seek out that food. And it's the biggest lever that dads can pull.
I love that, man. And that's really what your regimen is, what I've been following now for almost 2 years. It's not uncommon for me to OMAD, 2MAD, my meals. And I have found brain power in particular, especially so Mondays are actually my podcast day. I'll do 3 to 4 interviews, and that's the day that I do my longer fasts. And I find that I am so much more clear-headed, so much more productive on days like that. And I don't have the mental bandwidth of I'm worrying about where my next meal is coming from, because I literally do almost exactly what you're talking about. I do want to dive into the science a little bit with the apple cider vinegar, the lemon, what you call your lemonade. And I've read about it in your book, but as I really explored it, I was like, this is really fascinating, and I love the science behind it. But why do you do that from a scientific standpoint?
The apple cider vinegar and the lemon are both kind of the same effect. So, I mean, realistically, you could do it with just the ACV or just the lemon. They just kind of compound each other. But it's the acetic acid in the apple cider vinegar is what's really doing the trick. And it's a two-part equation. For one, if you are dealing with blood sugar issues, which isn't everybody, there's a lot of evidence to support vinegar in general, really. But apple cider vinegar is a little bit more pungent and a little bit more acetic acid as far as being able to slow the absorption of carbohydrates, kind of modulate your glucose that way. So I adopted that when I was dealing with, at the time, I was kind of coming down from type 2 diabetes. I was still technically in like pre-diabetes area as far as my numbers were concerned. And I was noticing a big difference with that. I was noticing that my glucose was more stable with the next meal that I did eat. And I started adding sort of that lemonade aspect to it because I wanted to start drinking it with meals, because that's where the literature was. It was like, okay, doing this fasted is great, but having this apple cider vinegar with meals actually makes a lot more sense because it's slowing down the absorption of the carbs and stabilizing glucose. So I'm like, well, I'm not just going to have like a tablespoon or two of apple cider vinegar with every meal. Like, what if I made it into a tasty drink? It's not exactly tasty, but it's better than straight apple cider vinegar. And you could kind of make it tasty. Like if you use a couple tablespoons of apple cider vinegar, half juice of half a lemon or a full lemon, whatever you want to do, You can put cayenne, you can put turmeric in it, which there is a lot of evidence to support that as well. Like turmeric, obviously, powerful anti-inflammatory. Cayenne has some interesting effects, just as far as the capsaicin is concerned, uh, thermogenic effects. So you get a little bit more of kind of a, I don't want to sound cheesy and call it a metabolic boost, but in a way it kind of is. There's also just digestive benefits of cayenne too. So you've got that working for you, but you don't have to have that in there. And then I usually put like some stevia or like a monk fruit in there to make it kind of sweet, and then add water to dilute it however much you need. And that way it kind of tastes like a lemonade. Um, you know, a little gritty, a little sour lemonade, but it's not bad. But doing that with meals was where it really made sense. Then there's the other element of it, which is acetic acid is going to activate what's called AMPK. So it almost puts you into, I don't want to say a deficit, but that is a way to describe it. The way that the acetic acid and kind of goes into a cell is it's basically, tricking, it's not the word. I'm trying to avoid sounding overly generic without also going super biochemical. But basically, the cell is registering that acid, and it sort of puts you into more of a deficit. And the literature suggests that it increases what's called AMPK, which is exactly what happens when you're in a deficit. So like if you are reducing calories, you have to think of it like a dimmer switch. You've got this dimmer switch. If you were fasting for 24 hours, that dimmer switch is cranked all the way down to -12, right? It's down all the way, and that means that you're in fat oxidation mode. That means you're in a caloric deficit, and you're probably losing weight. If you were to eat a ton of food, you'd be cranking it up the other way, but it's not a light switch, it's a dimmer, right? So a little bit of a deficit maybe turns it down to 1 or 2, or -1 or 2. A little bit of a surplus turns it up to a 1 or a 3. It's like, but if you crank it all the way, like when you're fasting, yeah, you're going to likely get more benefit. Like the deeper the deficit, the better the benefit. Just like the bigger the surplus, the bigger the downfall. I mean, it's just, so the nice thing with apple cider vinegar, sort of the drink that I would consider, is it's kind of attenuating it a little bit and putting you into a little bit of a deficit at baseline. So when you wake up in the morning, you're already in a deficit. Drinking that kind of puts you a little bit more in a deficit. And then let's say you go work out in that depleted/deficit stage, then you're turning that dimmer down even more. So I like to think of the apple cider vinegar as a little bit of a catalyst to sort of kickstart the day. I know kickstarting is a cheesy term to use, but it does. It sort of kickstarts, quote unquote, the deficit process a little bit more. Not to mention it wakes your ass up. Like it's pungent enough that you're like, whoa, okay, I'm awake.
It absolutely does. And you know what? Now that you say that, that is what I think I've been missing in my own personal drink is the stevia or the monk fruit, because I just slam it. So what I do, I take a little bit of water, half a lemon, I put in the apple cider vinegar, sprinkle some cayenne, sprinkle some turmeric, stir it up, and I just slam it. And it's like, it definitely zaps me, but I'll try the stevia, the monk fruit.
Yeah, just get like a
I do want to,
works really well.
I'll do that. Yeah. Yeah. Cause I know like I think you even talk about that in your book about the extract is better than the powder when it comes to stevia, correct?
Yep, correct.
Yeah. And why is that?
Well, because the powder usually has equal parts or a lot of times more maltodextrin than it even has stevia, right? So if you're getting a powder, it's like stevia is so sweet. It's like a tiny, tiny, tiny amount of stevia in the packets, and the rest is maltodextrin just to give it volume. Because if you had pure stevia in a packet, you'd open the packet and nothing would even come out. It's like, it's that barely need any stevia. So they mix it with maltodextrin so that there's some volume to it. So the problem is maltodextrin is dextrose. It's a pure carb. Like it's pure. So like when you start adding, especially if you're sweetening something that's sour, I mean, you're starting to look at like, okay, well now I'm talking 10 grams of carbs from maltodextrin by the time I actually get this thing sweet. So the liquid ones are usually suspended in, this isn't a plug for them, but the Lakanto liquid monk fruit is the one that I usually use. It's suspended in alcohol, but we're talking like you need like 2 drops of it. So it's like the alcohol, it's like, I mean, it's ridiculously negligible. It's not anything. And that way they suspend it in alcohol so it preserves it. But it's like water, alcohol. That's pretty much it.
Wow. That's okay. Yeah. Now talk to me about the benefits of, because a lot of people are very nervous about fasting, right? It's like, I got to eat every 3 hours. And a lot of people, I think, don't really understand the benefits of fasting, like the autophagy that happens. the scrubbing of the cells, you know, the anti-aging benefits that go with it. But talk to us about that.
Yeah, I mean, the first thing is like humans are like, it's going to sound crass, but if you can't go 24 hours without eating, then you need to change something. Like I was just interviewing Dr. Andy Galpin, who is like, I mean, he's been on Huberman. He is largely considered like one of the more like concrete, very evidence-based people that, you know, is middle of the road. And he even said, literally on my show, he said just that. He's like, if you can't go a day without food, you've got a problem. He's like, you're too adapted to food. And he's not a pro fasting guy. He works with pro athletes, and I don't think the professional athletes should be chronically fasting because there's just probably too much of a fuel demand. But I know a lot of MMA fighters that follow me, like George St. Pierre specifically. He follows me. He's a big fan because he fasts all the time. He's a big fan of that. So same with Dustin Poirier. And my point in saying that is we are designed to be able to go periods of time without food. No one's telling you not to drink water. But like, if you can't go 16 hours without food, you need to take a good hard look in the mirror and ask yourself if you are really human, because we need to be able to go periods of time without food. Like, how did we ever survive? Like, we have not become so adapted to food this quickly in time, right? Just 200 years ago, people would have to go days without food, potentially, right? 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago, possibly weeks without food. It just depended on the situation. So if we think that our bodies are that fragile that we're going to start decaying and breaking down after 16 hours of no food, it's like, read a book, because it's like, that's not how the human body works. And I know I sound like a prick saying that, but at a certain point, like, you got to be real with yourself. Like, we're enabling ourselves. We're destroying ourselves by consistently enabling ourselves to have food all the time. So like, I do get on a little bit of a pedestal with it, because it's like, guys, like, seriously, like, you don't need to be feeding yourself every 3 hours. That's not good. That's the problem the other direction. You need to be flexible. You need to be able to potentially eat all day, but you also need to be able to not eat all day. You know, you go too far the other way, and it can happen with fasting too. You can go too far that way, where you're so adapted to not eating that then when you do eat, your body rejects food. It's called overfeeding, or it's called refeeding syndrome, and it's a really real thing. So this isn't like a one-sided argument. We can definitely have the argument the other way. It's just, we're talking a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of a percent of people that have the opposite problem. The benefits of fasting, I mean, I'd start with just the gut benefits. I mean, just from a gut motility aspect, the gut needs to repair. And every time we are eating, it has to stop its repairing process. That's probably the biggest thing. There's so much chronic disease, so much stuff starts in the gut. And a lot of times if people do take care of their gut, it manifests in a healthier life in general. And that's the easiest place to start. It's like, think of your gut as an office building, and every time you eat, that's the employees in the office building making a mess. But when you stop eating and when the employees leave the office, that's when the janitorial crew can come in and actually clean. And that is the way that it works. Like, you have scrubbing that occurs, you have a cleaning that occurs, you have increases in motility, where your body actually increases motility of the gut when there's not food, to kind of get rid of the crud that's stuck in there. And it's really good. We need to give our gut a break. So for the sole reason of giving your digestive system a break, I think people should take a little bit of a break from food. But for a lot of people, at the risk of sounding very generic, you really just have to make sure that, like, when you're fasting, you're ensuring that your body gets at least a little bit of a deficit. Like, that's going into a deficit. All the benefits we talk about with fasting, autophagy, which is like sort of a cellular recycling where the cells break down unused components of themselves to basically survival of the fittest, help other cells or components of the cells get stronger and give them fuel. So let's get rid of the weak components we don't need. Since we're in a time of scarcity, let's eat the things that aren't really providing value to our bodies, our life. That is great. That can also happen with exercise. That can also happen with caloric restriction. The hard part is that it's really hard to get people to calorically restrict. It's not that hard to get people to exercise. Exercise definitely is a good autophagy inducer, but fasting is a pretty dang potent one. And it's really easy to do because you're just flipping a switch and not eating for a while. So it's like, you want the benefits of caloric restriction. Do you want to restrict calories every day and count your calories? Or do you just want to take a couple days a week and maybe just eat one meal those days? Like, for me, again, as a dad, it's just applicable. It just makes the most sense. instead of using MyFitnessPal and tracking every single thing that's going into my body and being like, ah, shoot, I had 2,600 calories today instead of 2,500. It's a loss. I would rather say, all right, you know what? I'm going to kind of eat what I want today within reason. And then tomorrow I'm just not going to eat. Like, just makes sense that way. That way I'm getting way more of that caloric deficit benefit in a much easier method.
What do you say to people that say, man, that's impossible. I couldn't go a day without eating. I mean, I understand, like you said, well, it's not really a human thing, but I think like I started fasting 2 years ago and doing fasts that you're talking about. And before fasting, I was like, how in the world am I going to do this? And then I started doing it and I'm like, it's way more mental than I ever thought.
It's all mental for sure. I mean, I shouldn't say it's all mental. There is a physical component. Like when you're first starting, like you're adapted to fuel. You're adapted to having fuel all the time. So when you all of a sudden do that, you got to give it time for the adaptations to happen, but they happen fast. We're talking a week, right? Mm-hmm. So it's like do a couple fasts, start with doing 12-hour fasts. What I tell people, it's like you can probably do a 12-hour fast without even realizing it. It's like you probably are already close to it. The only thing that's probably standing in the way of your 12-hour fast is probably your latte in the morning or something, right? It's like a lot of people stop eating at 7. Maybe they're not actually eating a meal till at least 7 a.m. Like you're doing a 12-hour fast, but you got up at 6 and you had a latte. So you actually made it more of an 11-hour fast. Or you, had, I don't know, some ice cream before bed. So it's like, if you just make a concerted effort to be like 7 to 7 or 6 to 6, like give yourself that. And you're like, oh, you did 12 hours. And then every week, so do that 2 or 3 times a week. And then every week, just add 2 hours onto that until you reach 20 hours. And I think 20 hours, and then you're like, okay, if I can do 20 hours, perfect. Because 20 hours you're giving yourself where you're basically just fasting throughout the day and still have dinner. And that's a great, like no one needs to go beyond that unless they want to. Like, I don't think there's a reason for people to go do 24 or 36 or 48-hour fasts unless they really want to. I think 20 hours is a great number to be adapted to because it's realistic, because there's going to be, and do it for utility, because there's going to be days when you're busy and you can't eat. And rather than being starving and miserable, wouldn't it be nice if you could just encounter those days where life throws stuff at you, but you're not hungry? You're at least just able to roll through the day. Because there's times like when I'm with a group of friends or something that aren't fat adapted, they're not used to fasting. And like we just get into something, or we're out on a hike or a big adventure, and they're just getting hangry and miserable at 1 p.m. And myself and one other friend of mine that always fasts, like we're just like, we're good, guys. Like, what, you guys want to go home or you want to finish this hike? Like, and they're dying, right? And it's not because they're out of shape. It's just because we didn't, these kinds of things happen all the time. So imagine that in the context of just a busy day at work or whatever, or out with the kids. It's just, hey, it's nice to have the flexibility to not feel like you're tied to eating. So it's a great just utility tool.
I agree. I totally agree. As we wrap up here, I want to ask you just 2 more questions. Number one, what is your position around optimal water intake for us? And then number 2, I've noticed just with your meals in general, you tend to stay more on the high protein, higher fat side. I do see some sweet potatoes in there every now and again, but I noticed that your meals, at least the ones that you post, are more geared towards higher protein, higher fat.
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, as far as that's concerned, yes. I mean, high protein is the main key there. That is like above all else, right? I came out of the low carb world for a long time because that's how I lost a lot of my weight. And I must admit, I kind of was in a bit of an echo chamber there for a long time. Like, not because I didn't like anything else, but just because like that's what worked for me. That's what I talked about. So I kind of created my own echo chamber. After I lost the weight, I realized that, okay, like I really like keto for how my brain feels, and that's great. But what I notice more is that I don't feel as good when my carbs are super high. Like that's everyone is different and everyone has different perspectives and different feelings on that. So I don't think there's any right or wrong way when it comes to carbohydrates, with the exception of one thing that I will take to my grave, as far as something that is like I'm adamant about, is I do not like the idea of combining fats and carbs together. I feel like in high amounts. I mean, obviously we're not that fragile, right? Yeah, everything comes back to this anti-fragile thing. Like, we don't want to be so fragile that like if we have a fat and a carb together that we can't tolerate it. But I believe that our biggest issue that we face as a society in terms of food is this hyperpalatability and a combination of high fats and high carbs together. Our bodies preferentially want to utilize one fuel source at a time. So if we eat, a little bit of almonds and a little bit of sweet potato, like those are digesting slow enough in moderate, like that's fine. But where we run into a problem is something that doesn't exist in nature, like a Twinkie, where it's, you know, however many grams of sugar and however many grams of fat in surplus, and you're eating 6 of them. It's like that is where the body's like, I don't know what to do. But it wouldn't be that extreme to go eat 50 grams or 100 grams of sugar even from fruit. And it wouldn't be entirely unrealistic to consume 50 or 75 grams of fat from meat. But when you're combining a lot of, like, you wouldn't be able to physically like do that. Like if you're eating like 2 ribeyes and 3 pineapples or something, it's just like, that's a lot of food. You'd get full before you ever ran into a problem. But in the way that it's condensed and compressed in today's world with hyperpalatable foods. So yes, I lean into protein, and I always eat the protein first with my meal, because that way I'm just like satisfying the hunger cues, and my body is listening, and I'm able to listen to my body. My body's listening to what I'm taking in, and it's reporting back to me. I have time to make decisions. Do I even really need to eat this entire sweet potato? Like, is my body actually hungry? Do I really need to eat this? And so I eat for satiety, and it's taken years for me to train my body for that, because especially as dudes, like we're oftentimes garbage disposals, especially as dads. Like, oh, there's food left over on the kid's plate, give it to me. Eat the rest of the wife's food. Like, it's just, but if you can eat the protein first, eat the fiber next, and then kind of start eating the other things, then you kind of realize like, okay, wait a minute, I'm actually not hungry. I don't need to eat the food off my kid's plate.
Yeah. I used to be the garbage disposal. What about optimal water? Like, how much water do we take in a day, and why?
It's a tough one, because that's super individual based on kidney function, just renal angiotensin, and all these different like things, aldosterone, things that regulate fluid in the body, can be highly, highly individual. I can tell you what I do. I mean, I aim for 3/4 of a gallon per day, not anything crazy. If I'm sweating a lot more, that might go up over a gallon. I'll tell you the mistakes that I used to make. I used to drink way too much water, and I was really diluting minerals a lot. When I was doing that, it was making it so that I would cramp a lot more during my exercises. And contrary to what people would think of this dehydration. Well, if you overhydrate, you do kind of dehydrate yourself too, because you're overhydrating, and then you're excreting a lot of minerals. And then when you do, and then so you're having less potential retention. So overhydrating can be problematic too. So I've had a lot more success with not cramping by actually backing off my water intake, because I used to drink like 1.5 gallons to 2 gallons a day. I was like, more water, more water. And yes, it would like make my face look a little more lean and things like that, because because I was flushing sodium out too, right? So it's like I was almost looking gaunt from it. And then I'm like, okay, let me back off the water so I retain a tiny bit more. Probably the biggest tip that I can give with water is load up your water early in the day and taper as the day goes on, just like you would with your food. A lot of people do the opposite. They get to 3 or 4 p.m., 5 p.m. They're like, crap, I haven't drinking much water today. I'm going to start pounding it. And then that disturbs your sleep. So it's like hydrate early in the morning and taper as the day goes on. And then like I try to like not really be consuming much fluid after like 6 p.m., maybe a little bit of tea or something, but most of my fluid intake is before like 2 p.m.
Interesting. Very cool, man. Well, dude, this was awesome. I really enjoyed having you on today, man. This was really enlightening. I've been wanting to do this now with you for a year, so I'm so glad we got it together. But I want to make sure that the guys can find you if they want to follow you, or you've got a book out there that's absolutely amazing. What is the best place for guys to follow you, connect with you?
I'd say YouTube is the best, just for dense subject matter for sure. If people want a little bit more like day in the life type stuff and shorter snippets, then Instagram's great too. And that's just at Thomas DeLauer. So pretty straightforward.
Well, guys, not to worry. We'll have all the links in the show notes for you. Just head on over to thedadedge.com/479 for this show. Again, thedadedge.com/479. Thomas, thanks for coming on, man. This was so cool. Yeah, man. Very, very fun, man. And best of luck to you. And keep rocking the new dad bod, will you?
Same to you,
like,
man.
This is what the dad bod I think should look like.
I'm with you.
Thanks, brother.
Thanks, man.